Welcome to this week's podcast by Step Kids Nutrition, where we explore matters related to pediatric nutrition with an invited guest. My name is Professor Roseanne Meyer. I'm a specialist pediatric dietitian with almost 30 years of experience in pediatric nutrition. In each podcast episode, we will dive into the science and also practical tips behind topics related to childhood nutrition with an invited specialist. Whether you're a healthcare professional, a parent, or just interested in pediatric nutrition, you're at the right place. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have a friend and a dietetic colleague, Paula Hallam. Today, Paula is a specialist pediatric dietitian like me and founder of Plant-Based Kids. She's been a dietitian since 1998, also a very long time, and has experience in a great variety of different pediatric domains. And Paula, I know you also are qualified as a pediatric dietitian with a certificate of postgraduate advanced pediatric dietetics. You worked at Great Ormond Street. I know you worked in other domains, and you've worked also at Evelina Hospital. You have taken the additional training in plant-based nutrition, a sustainable diet and optimal health by University of Winchester, which I know I did after you've done that. And you've published a book on plant-powered little people, and you provide one-to-one sessions for parents on plant-based nutrition, and you also have your Plant Power Family Hub, which, by the way, we will provide links for families and for healthcare professionals that are listening to us. So thank you very much, Paula. Did I leave anything out?
No, that's all good. That's all good, Roseanne. Thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
Paula, I wanted to launch on this podcast on plant-based nutrition with your personal journey as a dietitian to get to plant-based nutrition for kids. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, sure, of course. So as you said, I've been dietitian for a long time and been in various different roles. And then when I had children, like many people, I wanted to have a little bit more flexibility. So started doing a little bit more freelance work. But it actually wasn't until it's about 6 years ago now. My daughter's now 16 and she was about 10 at the time, my youngest daughter, where she came to me and said, I don't want to eat meat anymore. I want to be vegetarian. So I was like, okay, absolutely fine. Let's do this. So as a family, we did include meat, but I wouldn't say that was like a sort of emphasis in our diet at all. But I started looking into it, started reading up, looking at recipes, having a look at things. And that's sort of what brought me to the sort of my professional life as a pediatric dietitian, and my personal life as my family came together. And when I started looking into the what was out there, so much inspiration, so much food inspiration, amazing recipes, incredible stuff like that out there, but not much in terms of guidance, particularly for families, and looking at children's nutrition and how their nutritional needs are different to adults. So that's what led me to think, actually, I think there are probably other families, parents out there who might need who might want this sort of guidance, information, support. And so that's when I started my Plant-Based Kids platform and just started building that. And it's kind of grown from there.
Yeah. And I think that really offers strength. You have not only got the qualifications and the experience, you live it. You really live it. And I think that's so important, because for families and parents listening to this podcast, it really means that you can provide the practical advice. I've looked at your book, which is also amazing. And we'll also make sure that there's a little screenshot and a link for healthcare professionals and parents. Paul, I wanted to start off with debunking some myths. And I think the first question I've got for you is, what is a plant-based diet? Because I think there is a lot of confusion around what is a plant-based diet.
Yeah. I think that's a brilliant place to start. And there definitely is a lot of confusion and around it. I think it's important to say that there actually isn't one kind of universally agreed, like this is the definition. So there are various different sort of takes on it and different kind of definitions out there. So the British Nutrition Foundation talks about plant-based diets as being diets or eating patterns that have an emphasis on plants. And when we talk about plants, I don't just mean kind of fruits and vegetables. We're talking about fruits, vegetables, legumes, so your beans, lentils, pulses, nuts, seeds, whole grains. So a combination of those foods. And it might be, and it's a bit of a spectrum. So it might be that some people or families are eating 100% plant-based, so only those plant foods, or they might be eating predominantly plant-based diet, where they're eating sort of mainly plants and then might add small amounts of animal foods, maybe eggs or something. Then you might get families who are vegetarians, include eggs and dairy and then you might get the sort of the kind of flexitarian, which is a term that's kind of come in over the last few years, where people mostly eat plants but do eat some meat, fish, poultry, eggs and dairy as well. So it's a bit of a spectrum along there. So I think the main thing is that plant-based diets have an emphasis on plants. So the main part of your diet is from plants, and then there may or may not be some sort of extras from animal foods included as well.
And that's an important message, that plant-based diets does not mean equals vegan, where I think certainly in the healthcare professional domain, I've often seen this pushback and saying, well, I don't advocate a vegan, but it doesn't mean necessarily that. It does also introduce the complexity around the research in this topic because of this lack of definition around it.
Definitely.
I want to kind of migrate into the next kind of domain and around the question of, why do you think there's been this increase in plant-based diets? I mean, this whole spectrum, as you already mentioned, of from vegan, vegetarian, ovo-lacto, or just ovo. Why have we seen this increase?
I think there's there's a number of reasons. I think a huge driving factor, and particularly for sort of younger people, the sort of environmental climate area. So a lot of people are obviously care about that, the environmental impact of various food practices. And then, of course, animal welfare, the ethical side of it as well, is a huge factor for many, many families. In fact, for a lot of families I speak to, the sort of the ethical side of it is kind of where how they sort of have first come to this. And then for some people, health reasons as well. We know, and there's more and more research coming out, the importance of fiber. You only get fiber from plant foods. And we used to always talk about fiber as being, sort of almost just like the sort of prevention of constipation kind of thing, just the sort of the keeping keeping you regular, that sort of thing. But we know now that, fiber, feeding the gut microbiome, there's just, it affects almost every organ in the body. There's just, I think there's a lot more understanding, certainly from health professionals and the public as well, on that aspect. But I think a big driver is the sort of the environmental aspect, the climate change, and that all the plant foods have got a low environmental impact, and also that we eat at least 3, 4, 5 times a day. It's something that as an individual that we can do, that we can sort of power to change what's on our plate. We don't necessarily have the power to influence governments. Well, we can protest, but like fossil fuel and all these like big things that feels maybe sometimes impossible to kind of change. You as an individual can make, these small changes, changing what you eat can make a huge difference. And as an individual, you really feel you can. So I think that's a lot of the reasons why there's been sort of more of an uptake of plant-based diets in general.
Yeah, and certainly for me, I've seen the increase, after the Eat Lancet in 2019 came out with a publication and coming out clean, that was not targeted at children. So they said only from 2 years of age. And they've updated that recently, the Lancet range, and updated their guidance. So I've seen exactly what you've seen as well. And I think the health benefit also has driven many of the adults.
Yes.
For me as well.
Yes.
Has driven my motivation.
Yeah.
So I think now come the very important questions that parents and healthcare professionals have is, can children safely follow a plant-based diet? And I want to kind of open the field to saying children from complementary feeding stage, because I think that's the question that we get. And you can split it up if you want in saying, okay, I want to think about the toddlers and then the oldest, but can it safely be done?
Yeah. So yes, I think absolutely. Of course, there are some considerations that we need to take into account, but it absolutely can be done safely. There is more and more research coming out to support this. And obviously we'll get into what nutrients we need to sort of pay particular attention to and all of that. But I think it's important to say that it definitely can be done safely. And, that there was a recent meta-analysis and systematic review, which came out, I think it was December last year, 2025, which obviously looked at a large number of studies. I think it was about 50 studies or so. And they found that the vegan and vegetarian children grew within the healthy ranges. Yes, they tended to be leaner than omnivorous children, but that can really be an advantage. So I think often the sort of the headlines pick out only the negative parts, but actually that systematic review found that the vegan and vegetarian children had lower total and LDL cholesterols. They were leaner. They had higher intakes of vitamin C, of fiber, of lots of other vitamins and minerals, iron, magnesium, all of these things. So I think the positive things aren't sensational, and so those aren't necessarily brought to the headlines, but definitely they can grow really healthily. We need to make sure they're having enough calories, enough energy, enough fats, all of those things to support their growth. But yeah, definitely can be done, and with a little bit of planning, of course.
And I think here, before we go into the specifics, I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit around what is the healthcare professional guidance? I mean, you've talked about the systematic review. Is there a position, I don't know, UK, Europe, around providing pediatricians, because there will be pediatricians listening here, and not all of the countries have the number of pediatric dietitians guiding.
Of course.
What is the official guidance, across the board, would you say, plant-based diets for children?
Yeah, sure. So the BDA, the British Dietetic Association, the American Association, Nutrition and Dietetic Association. Sorry, I can't remember the official academy, isn't it? The official name. They, and many other organizations as well, Canadian, Australian, they've all come out saying that they support plant-based diets, even what's sometimes referred to as the most restrictive, like vegan diets. I don't really like that word restrictive, but, even vegan diets can be followed at all life stages. So including during pregnancy, including breastfeeding, including infancy, through childhood and adolescence. So they've come out with supporting that. And some of the organizations have said that they have gone sort of further and said that there are actually health benefits as well. So they do say in their statements that it must be well planned, of course. So, that is something that is stated. But I think the general consensus is that it can safely be followed, and there are those organizations that have specifically come out and said that it is safe to do so throughout those life stages.
Yeah, when I looked at the data, well, actually the guidelines, it's interesting. It's primarily English-speaking countries that are very pro. I have found in some European countries, in particular Germany, so Germany's got some opposing guidelines to say they advise against. In France it's also
Spain, I think a little bit. Yeah, they're a little bit more hesitant and say that there must be under dietetic supervision. They're not sort of against it as such, but they might say things like they need some dietetic supervision, which I think is not unreasonable, although not everyone obviously has access to a dietitian, and there might be some sort of additional things that they sort of advocate for. But yeah, I think overall it is accepted that it is safe to do so as long as it is well planned, of course.
Exactly. And I think here for the healthcare professionals, from a well planned, I mean, both you and me have done the extra qualification, and I can only say it's really been a great addition to my qualifications, because whenever I had discussions with my European healthcare professional colleagues, that is the concern they have, is that they've not got the extra education around plant-based diets. So therefore the response has been, okay, no, I'm not recommending it because I don't know how.
Yes, exactly. It sounds like, oh, that sounds a bit, sort of scary or something. And yeah, I think that often comes from not necessarily having that extra education, extra training. It doesn't, I don't think it requires, it sounds scary, extra planning or whatever, but it's just we'll go into some practical things, but it's just, sort of having these practical ideas, knowing what to do, what to offer, working with children, and supporting their growth and their nutrition. And I also think it's important to say that by offering animal-based foods, it's not like a guarantee that a child's going to get all their nutrients because of that. I totally get it that certain things might be more concentrated in certain nutrients and things like that, but it's, an automatic, that they definitely will be getting all the nutrients. We need to be mindful, no matter what eating pattern children have, that, that we are sort of planning things and being intentional about certain things.
Yeah. And I think I want to paraphrase, I might not know the exact sentence again, but actually any child on any dietary restriction is at risk of, so it's not just on plant-based nutrition.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to launch into more specifics.
Yeah.
You've
Okay.
already kind of gave us this reassurance that children grow well, so they're leaner. But, I think also we want to turn that on its head, especially with the previous highlight of a well-known UK magazine that had, or paper that had this headline
Yes.
of increased malnutrition, is that the headline should have been, for me, that plant-based nutrition leads to less obesity.
Yes, exactly. Instead, they said they're skinnier and shorter. Exactly. That we have, that children being, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, we should definitely be making sure children are growing well, and absolutely. But we have more of a problem, of a public health problem of children being overweight. So, the fact that they were less overweight is really great and positive and a huge advantage.
Yeah. So I'm going to look into macronutrients. So macronutrients, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. So in the context of a plant-based diet, which are within the macronutrients? We'll migrate to micro, but macronutrients that you think need to be taken into account, have special consideration in a plant-based diet.
Yeah. Okay. So plant-based diet is abundant in carbohydrates, fiber, we know that. So that's brilliant. Fats and protein, I think we do need to sort of be aware of or take note of, not to be sort of like worried necessarily, but to be aware. So fats obviously are very calorie dense, and a lot of plant foods are naturally low in fat. Your beans, your lentils, pulses, a lot of foods are naturally lower in fat. So we do need to be aware that we don't want to fill children up without them getting their sort of nutrient and energy intake. So offering more sort of nutrient and energy dense foods. So things like nut butters, seeds, avocado, using olive oil, or, roasting foods. All of those things to make sure that little ones, especially young children now I'm talking about, and obviously adolescents and, active children, we need to just be aware that we don't want to sort of restrict their fat as such, that we want to make sure that they are getting those fats, because obviously meat and certainly whole, full fat dairy does provide quite a lot of fats and energy. So fats, I think that's definitely one to be aware of. And then protein, a lot of people, parents and health professionals sort of worry about protein. And I'm not saying, oh, it's fine, just don't worry about it. We do need to sort of consider it, but I think there's a sort of an over worry maybe of it. But I recommend to parents a protein food, high protein food at each meal. That usually goes hand in hand with an iron-rich food, so that's handy as well. But your beans, your lentils, your tofu, soya milk, or a pea-based milk. So those ones tend to be higher in protein. So those are helpful. Other soya foods like tempeh, soya mince, perhaps. All of those foods provide really good sources of protein. Of course, your nuts and seeds also provide, the healthy fats and the protein. So they are really great things to include, and quite easy to include different meals. So so I think by being sort of intentional about those things, we can definitely make sure that they're having enough.
And Paula, if I can just, because I get constant this question saying, can you get all the amino acids? So it's not just protein, but those essential amino acids, can you get them from plant-based sources?
Yeah, I know. That's a question I get all the time as well. So absolutely, yes. We know that all plants actually contain all 20 of the amino acids, including the 9 essential amino acids in differing amounts, so proportionately lower amounts of certain amino acids. But there are no plant foods that are completely missing or completely lacking any of the amino acids, which is actually really interesting. And I actually learned that when I did that sustainable diets and plant-based nutrition course, and that just really highlighted that. So what we know from that is that we need to eat a variety of foods. So of course, if a child or a person is eating, only rice, only pasta, or conversely only beans or only lentils, one food's a very, very, very limited, very, very low variety of foods, you might run into problems. But as long as a child is eating a variety, and it doesn't have to be a huge variety, but some variety across the day. You can offer them in the same meal, but you don't have to offer these. We used to talk about complementary proteins, the jack potato with beans, or, the rice and black beans, that sort of thing. I mean, those are great combinations still, you don't have to avoid those, but equally, you don't have to make sure that in every meal there are these across the day, which you recommend within 24 hours, within a day, trying to make sure that your little one has some variety during the day. And the body's quite clever. Proteins are broken down to the amino acids, they're building blocks, and then the body puts them together again and sort of builds the other proteins within our bodies that we need for all the various functions to make antibodies and hormones and enzymes and all the things that we need in our body. Yes, I think, if you're in certain parts of the world where there's an incredibly low access to certain foods, that there might be a problem of getting that variety. But I'd say in general, if you live in places where we have access to these types of foods, and you can have a variety, as long as we're having that variety of foods, we can get all those essential amino acids.
Yeah, and that's something that I also learned when I did the course. This myth that you have to do the combination. It's all about the variety.
Yeah.
It's partly moving to the micronutrients, but I want to, because it is linking to a macronutrient, and that's, you talk about good fats, and that is a concern that often gets highlighted around the omega-3 fatty acids, because of course there are lots of plant-based sources that are high in omega-3 fatty acids, but that would not be DHA or EPA. So can you just explain to the listeners, what can you do to in fact achieve your DHA and EPA requirements? Because I often get this and saying, okay, but you can't do that. It's not sufficient just to have your plant-based omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, sure. So the omega-3 fats, the essential ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, you can get. There are plenty of plant-based sources, like you just mentioned, Roseanne. So things like your walnuts, your chia seeds, hemp seeds, flax seeds, and their oils are all really good sources of that ALA, the sort of the parent, the essential fat, and then that gets converted through a series of steps to EPA and DHA. But what the research shows us is that we're not exactly sure how efficient that conversion is. So you do get some conversion down to those things. So we do think that in sort of vulnerable or sort of particularly, high growth area at periods, that giving an algae oil based supplement that contains the actual already formed DHA and EPA is probably a good idea. So for under twos, definitely, and pregnant women and breastfeeding women, I would always say, if they are totally plant-based. So some families are, sort of mainly plant-based, predominantly plant-based, and they still include eggs, for example, or maybe they still include a little bit of oily fish. And then they'd be able to get enough DHA from that. But just to make sure, just because we're not sure exactly how much of that is converted, I always say definitely in under twos and pregnant women, breastfeeding women, to give that algae oil a supplement. So you can get, the little drops, very small amounts. You only need, usually it's about a mil, 2 mils, something like that, to take those. Or obviously for adults, you can take little capsules and things like that. So usually for babies and young children, I recommend definitely from age 1. If they, before that, if they are breastfeeding, for their breastfeeding mum to be taking supplements, then they will be getting DHA through breast milk or otherwise through infant formula. But from the age of 1, when food is providing more of their nutrition, then I would recommend those drops, having some DHA, EPA drops, just to make sure that they are definitely getting enough of those. also offering those, nuts and seeds as well, because of course they have so many other benefits as well as providing some of those omega-3 fats. They've also got, vitamin E, fiber, minerals, things like that. So still offering those, but just giving that little top up. So we definitely make sure that they are getting enough of the DHA.
And so that is a transitional question now towards the micronutrients. Which are the micronutrients in plant-based diets that you would say are of significant concern?
Okay. Yeah. So I like to think of it as sort of nutrients of importance. And I think we can think of the micronutrients of importance as in sort of two camps. So the one sort of micronutrients we need to prioritize within foods, and then ones which we might need to look to fortified foods and or supplements to really make sure that we are getting enough of those, the right amount of those micronutrients. So in terms of micronutrients within foods, so as with all, babies and young children, iron is an absolutely critical nutrient. We know that iron stores really start running quite low from 6 months. They're born with enough stores to last around about till 6 months. So from when we start introducing foods, we need to add in a food source of iron-rich foods. And I think with plant-based weaning, plant-based eating, we need to be really intentional about this. We know that the type of iron from plant foods, the non-heme iron, is absorbed slightly less efficiently as the heme iron that you get from animal foods. But studies show that the iron intakes of vegan and vegetarian children are generally higher than omnivorous children. So their intakes are usually higher, but when we look at the bioavailability, the absorption, that isn't as high as those animal foods. So we need to help that along. Really nature has provided, and vitamin C and other vitamins like beta carotene increase the absorption of ions. I always say to families, iron plus color 3 times a day, essentially as a little sort of mantra to remember, so that, your colorful foods that are providing the vitamin C and beta carotene, those vitamins increase the absorption of iron, of your non-heme iron. And it's quite significant, increases it, 3-4 times or more. It really is definitely worth doing that. So I'd say iron is definitely a nutrient of importance. Zinc as well. So we know that for all children, zinc is important, but for plant-based children particularly, and most of the iron-rich foods are also sources of zinc, which is great. So your beans, your lentils, your tofu, whole grains, all of those are good sources of both, your nuts and seeds as well. Of course, you do get zinc in dairy if some families are including some dairy products as well. And obviously, seafood and things like that as well. But for completely plant-based families, your legumes are your kind of heroes, and your nuts and seeds are definitely the ones to start offering early when starting solids in the weaning. And obviously some of those foods need to be modified. Obviously whole nuts are choking hazard. Beans and lentils, need to be modified slightly, mashing those down, finding the right texture. So I think that's an important sort of practical aspect to talk to parents about, because it's all very well saying, you must introduce, beans and lentils and these, iron-rich foods early on, but, giving them the tools, the guidance on actually, okay, what does that look like? How am I going to give it to my baby? What's the, the right texture? How am I going to cook it? Or all of those things. How am I going to, offer it to them, mashing it or making it into like a little shape that they can pick up themselves. Tofu is a great one because it's a really soft, spongy, great texture for little ones. Yeah. So thinking about, I think, nutrients and foods that provide them, but then also, okay, how are we going to offer those to a baby?
What about vitamin B12?
Yes, of course. So going back to the micronutrients. So in terms of the nutrients that we need to get, that we were thinking about the foods and providing those nutrients. And then there are some nutrients that we do need to look towards fortified foods or supplements. So with vitamin B12, it is an absolute non-negotiable. Everyone following plant-based diet, children, adults, everyone must take, really important to take a vitamin B12 supplement. Some of the research says that even vegetarians, even including dairy, might need a vitamin B12 supplement as well. So it's really really, really important. It has so many important functions in the body, from, preventing neurological different conditions, and, important for our blood cells and for healthy blood. So really, really vital. And with toddlers and obviously little ones, they don't necessarily predictably eat the same foods or same amounts of things. So, I think fortified foods can be helpful, useful, but with little young ones, I really recommend a supplement so that we are making sure, okay, they're getting the right amount, they're getting that every day, and we're not sort of, did they eat enough of that, or, sort of worrying about if they've had enough from foods. But there are some fortified foods, some of the plant-based drinks or kind of milks have got vitamin B12. Some cereals have got B12 added. Nutritional yeast often has B12 added, mama yeast extracts, those types of things. But I think for little ones, I always recommend a supplement, and a supplement that is a bit higher than the RNI. So it's recommended 2.5 to 5 micrograms a day for toddlers, which is considerably higher than the RNI, because not all of what we give in the supplement is absorbed. So we want to make sure that they're actually getting enough. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm glad you highlighted that. And I'm glad also you highlighted about that plant-based proteins, the legumes, are not low in iron. It's just the bioavailability.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Is iodine a concern for you?
Sure. So iodine is definitely one that we need to, sort of be aware of, definitely. And actually the research has shown, one of the really big studies that's been done in the last 5 years or so, the Vici study from Germany, they showed that actually across all three, so the omnivorous children, the vegetarian children, and the vegan children, they all had quite low iodine intakes. But of note, the vegan children did have the lowest. So it is something that we definitely need to be aware of. There aren't many food sources of iodine. So the main food sources are seafood, particularly whitefish, dairy, and then a little bit in eggs. And you get tiny amounts in plants, depending on where the soil and where they're grown. But in general, plant foods are not a very reliable source of iodine. You do get iodine in seaweed, but it can be in really huge, excessive quantities. And so generally, I don't recommend that for children as a sort of reliable way of having iodine, because we might not, they might be getting too much, and too much iodine is also not great. So we need iodine to make thyroid hormones, and too little iodine and too much is not healthy for the thyroid. So a supplement of iodine is also recommended. They don't only need like microgram quantities, again, same as B12, but it's really, really important that we make sure they are getting enough. Just wanted to mention, of course, there are lots of supplements out there, but the Vegan Society has got a really great one called Veg One Baby and Toddler, which is a liquid. It's 5 mils, or is it less than that? It's quite a small amount that they have to take, and it's got vitamins A, C, and D. So the ones we recommend for all breastfed children, babies and children under 5. And it's also got vitamin B12, iodine, and a little bit of selenium. So selenium obviously is similar to iodine, a mineral, also sort of a soil mineral, and there aren't huge number of sources either. Nuts, particularly Brazil nuts, are a really good source, but people aren't necessarily eating that every day. You do get little bits amounts sort of scattered throughout as well in other plant foods. But yeah, those are all included. So it's a really good kind of all round with those nutrients, and then just adding a DHA EPA supplement, and then you'll be sort of covering everything. So I think there is this perception that if children are completely plant-based, they need a load of supplements. And it's not a load, but it's a few targeted ones are really important.
Yeah. And I think it's at this point good to kind of also highlight around the research that, well, you can correct me here, but the majority of research, I found one study that was in one of the Nordic countries, but most of the research was not research where there was a dietitian or a qualified healthcare professional that advised.
Yes.
There were more these population observational studies.
Yes.
And for me, that's quite reassuring in that sense when I use it as an argument to say, look, actually, any of the deficiencies, and there are not many of them that they've highlighted, you have to remember this was not interventional.
Yes.
So that's why I quite like the suggestion of saying, talk to somebody that knows their way around it.
Yeah.
And that advice, exactly as you said, it does not need to be complicated.
No, exactly. Absolutely. That's a really good point, actually. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I think that is a really good point. Just wanted to quickly mention, Roseanne, back to the micronutrients, some of the studies show that the calcium intake can be on the lower side in some vegan and vegetarian children. Now, again, we do have to remember that, like you said, that these studies are observational, in different parts of the world where they have different types of these plant-based drinks or milks. Many of them in a lot of other European countries aren't fortified, or only a certain percentage of them are fortified. So we do need to be aware of calcium as well. I think there is, this perception that you can only get calcium from dairy products. Of course, dairy is a really good source of calcium, but there are lots of other foods that are also good sources of calcium. So using a fortified plant-based drink, like my sort of top choice is usually an unsweetened fortified soy milk for most families. Of course, if a child is allergic to soy, there are other options like pea-based ones or oat-based ones, which are slightly lower in protein, but making sure it's fortified is really important. So the organic ones are generally not fortified. So just having a check on the back of your carton, has it got calcium, has it got vitamin D, great, and then has it got B12, B2, iodine? Those are sort of an added bonus, but calcium, vitamin D, are those in there. And then there are other sources of calcium, of course. We know green vegetables, broccoli, kale are really good sources of calcium. But, realistically, toddlers are not going to be eating massive amounts of those. So they can contribute, but I wouldn't say they are the sort of main source. Tofu is a really concentrated source, particularly the calcium set tofu that uses calcium salts as the coagulant. That is a really great, you can get a lot of calcium from quite small amounts. So that's useful for, toddlers, babies, smaller appetites. And then things like, tahini, sesame seeds, nuts, seeds, legumes, the almonds, they all contribute to calcium. And I think those are great to include, but they aren't necessarily going to be the sort of the main source or the sort of the concentrated source that a toddler might be having. So I think that's just important on those practical points. Yeah.
No, that's very useful. Paula, as we're kind of going to the end of our discussion, I want to finish off with a quite a meaty question, because you talked about plant-based beverages there. It is the question around the ultra-processed nature of some of the ready prepared plant-based foods that we've got. So where do you sit on this kind of the fact that, some of our plant-based drinks, they need to have, some of them have to have gums in to stabilize. And also sometimes there's a plant-based burger patty that they use. So where do you sit on this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a really important question and discussion to have about ultra-processed foods. And I think it's important to say that as a nation, as a population, or even globally, we are eating too many processed foods, and we do need to look at that. But we also need to consider that the term ultra-processed foods and the sort of that category includes a huge variety of foods, a huge number of foods. So everything from, your sweets, Haribos, donuts, cakes, ready meals, processed meats, fizzy drinks, to, some supermarket breads, even high fiber supermarket breads, and plant-based milks. They're all in the same sort of ultra processed category. So I don't think we should sort of, tarnish everything with the same brush kind of thing. And it's important to think of, like, okay, so a packet of Haribos is only giving you energy and sugar. It's not really providing any other nutrients. But plant-based milks that are fortified are providing, calcium, vitamin D. If it's a soy milk, protein, it's providing good sources of nutrition. Breads might, that are particularly whole grain breads, are providing fiber, B vitamins. They've also got some protein in there, calcium, flours are fortified. So I think it's important to consider the nutrition as well, and not sort of blanketly say, okay, absolutely no ultra processed food at all. In terms of things like, gum stabilizers, etc., I think the research is still really emerging in terms of like emulsifiers and things like that, additives in foods. And I don't think, I definitely don't think we need to disregard it. It is really, really important. But equally, we know that there are some emulsifiers or some additives that potentially have more sort of health risks or adverse sort of health outcomes than others. So, we do know that some of the emulsifiers like polysorbate 60 and 80, CMC, carboxymethyl cellulose, and carrageenan, those ones tend to be the ones that are, again, it's still a potential. It's not like a definite. So if you are having those occasionally, that's fine. It's also the dose as well. If these are in every single of your meals that you're having, and a large part of your diet, that's going to be much more of a problem than if they're a small part of your diet. And my understanding is things like gums do not have adverse health outcomes in terms of the gut and the gut microbiome. I think the research is still evolving and there are things emerging and we're learning things all the time. But yeah, I think it's important to consider the nutrition that these foods and drinks could provide. And there's a really good study that looked at ultra processed foods, but sort of divided them into sort of subcategories, and what they found and looked at health outcomes. So in terms of chronic diseases, so like type 2 diabetes, increased risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, things like that. And they really found that, the kind of what you'd expect, the fizzy drinks, the ultra processed meats, the ultra processed meats, those things had increased risk of those chronic diseases. But things like foods that even would be considered ultra processed but have got high fiber, and your plant-based milks, and even the processed plant-based meats, the processed vegan foods don't have the same health outcomes, aren't associated with those adverse health outcomes. So, in terms of meat alternatives, like the vegan burgers or sausages or things like that, I think they can be, a tasty addition to the diet. They can provide, protein. They can help people if they're wanting to transition between sort of having a meat heavy diet to more plants. They can help, some transition. I'm definitely not recommending them for little ones, and definitely not every day. But, having them occasionally, once a week, let's say, or something like that, I don't think the research supports that there's any adverse effects of that. And, looking at their salt content, their saturated fat content, so looking at it overall and not just, okay, they're processed. Oh, absolutely, can't include those. So it's quite nuanced, isn't it? Sorry, that was a really, really long answer, but there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, I think it's a good answer. And I think that's very much in line with what I say, is that at the moment, you want to have as homemade as possible. You need to look at the whole diet and see the nutritional contribution, because you and me still see in our clinical practice more children that have insufficient calcium, insufficient, for example, low micronutrients, where I kind of go, if I can prevent poor growth or bone mineralization through a product, because at the end, the supplements also have, mannitol, all of those added. So it's this really balanced view, and I think that's what you've tried to highlight. It's look at the diet overall and what the overall diet contributes, rather than focusing on a plant-based beverage, for example.
Exactly. Yeah, I get so many questions about plant-based milks. I think it's probably the thing that people ask me the most, which is, it's understandable. But I think it's keeping it in context. The overall, a plant-based diet is going to have, plenty of colorful foods. Your fruits and vegetables are going to have whole grains. It's going to have pulses, seeds, all these, really nutritious foods. And, if we can easily provide enough, make sure that the child's getting enough calcium with that drink, then I think it's a great addition to their diet. And like you said, looking at things overall.
Yeah. Paula, on that really positive message, I just want to say thank you so much for spending the time. For the listeners, we will provide resources, in the appropriate areas throughout this podcast. And I'm also really want to say, Paula, you've educated us and really helped us. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been absolutely lovely being here.
Thank you for listening or watching this week's podcast. You can follow me on various social media platforms, which we'll share on the screen, or you can visit my website at rosannepediatricdietitian.com. You can also like this podcast on our Step by Step Kids Nutrition YouTube channel. Thank you very much.